Brazil. 3 million square miles, 50 million souls, the heartland of a hemisphere. What is Brazil? Viewed in perspective, it's a mosaic. Old as the new world is old, and yet young and growing under the sun. A robust, broad-shouldered, blue-ribbon citizen among the nations. A mosaic created out of the centuries wherein the tiles of time are set harmoniously side by side. A mosaic of land, fourth largest country on Earth, vast in space and variation. A mosaic of economic patterns, here abreast of the 20th century, there laboring on the fringe of it. An eager young nation with its eyes on the future, but only partially emerged from the past. A mosaic of bloods, the descendants of the Portuguese conquerors, the Negro, the Indian. And superimposed others who came later to this land of promise, Germans, Italians, Orientals. A mosaic of religions, but traditionally Roman Catholic, the Catholicism of the early conquerors, yet poised above the flow of life in the land. But as part of that mosaic of religions, a new and vital force is making its way into the lives of the people, teaching and preaching by word and by act, freedom and the brotherhood of man. Protestantism, evangelical Christianity, more than a way of worship, a way of life. Evangelical Christianity, perseverant, pioneering, is reaching the neglected masses of people in Brazil, bringing the gospel to the physical and human frontiers of the land, wherever they may be. Space. This is the strength and the weakness of Brazil, the promise and the problem the nation lives with. The vast earth is a rich reservoir, but scarcely tapped, a treasure house for tomorrow. And yet today, a tyrant who takes his toll in time. "40 days, Roger Perkins and his muleteer circuit, and there were weeks ahead before it would be done. The mule is the mainstay of missions inland from the coast. The mule with a temperament stubborn as the terrain. It's carried the gospel for nearly 2,000 years. Such a creature breeds confidence, but kills time. And something of the animal's disposition must be absorbed by the rider. Patience, Roger Perkins told himself over and over again. Patience or the land will lick you. 40 days from Montes Claros, 40 days across the mountains to reach these villages. The sight of them again, after so long, of any of the villages so long neglected, dissolved the distance, diluted the time. 40 days, what did it matter? They were here. Space destroyed, faith renewed by the clasp of a hand. After nearly 2 years, he heard them again. "At last you've come. We've waited so long. We've done what we could. We've met. We've read from the book and prayed together. Our numbers have grown, but there are many questions, many things we want to know. We are poor, ignorant country people. We need your help." And they asked, "How long can you stay?" Perkins always dreaded that question. Only a few days. There are so many places to go to. After a week of ministry in the village, they were back on the trail, at grips again with space. Time, again, the price of the ride. Time to talk to oneself. Patience. Like the mule, be patient. Roger Perkins talked to himself a good deal. For Roger was impatient by nature, and there was so much to be done. He was impatient now, eager to reach the next village and see Bernardo and his family. Bernardo, the crente, the believer. The layman who more than any man kept the evangelical movement growing for 100 miles about his village. Bernardo, a great Christian, a best friend. And then, at a fazenda near Bernardo's village, he heard troubling news. The crente was sick, very sick. In the village, a woman said the crente was dying, perhaps already dead. At Bernardo's house, the air seemed heavy, weighted with the sorrow in it. It was as though he could feel the presence of sickness. And as he walked, his legs were numb beneath him. From the moment he entered the house of his friend, he knew. Perhaps it was the odor of herbs cooking in the kitchen. Perhaps the quality of the silence. But whatever it was, the knowledge came sharp and painful to him. It was hovering in the air, and he knew. Luisa and the girl. Their expressions were eloquent, and a look at Bernardo froze his blood. Luisa told him how it was, and he understood. Probably a ruptured appendix. There was nothing to be done. The nearest doctor was 60 miles to the east, 4 days by cart. Bernardo couldn't live to see the second of those days, and the agony in the cart on those roads. Time, distance, 2 grim hands throttling him, murdering Bernardo. And he had to stand there and by his silence tell Luisa and the girl that there was nothing to be done. After ministering to the family, praying with them, doing what he could, Roger found a moment to be alone. Patience, he told himself. Patience, or the land will defeat you. But he could think only of Bernardo dying and nothing he could do to save him. Now again, Roger Perkins talked to himself, talked to someone far greater than himself, someone whose presence he needed so desperately now. He prayed for Bernardo, for the work, and he prayed for his own self-control, for patience, for guidance, and for faith. An answer, straight out of heaven. If he had a plane, he could take Bernardo to a hospital in a matter of hours. If he had a plane, he could come to these villages often, to the many villages still unreached. He could be flying the gospel out to the people. If he had a plane, he could stop wasting God's time. Thereafter, Roger Perkins launched a one-man crusade to secure an airplane for his work. He returned to Rio and labored with all the energy generated by his dream. At the annual mission meeting, he peeled off and dove straight at the heart of his target. He told them, "We've simply got to have an airplane." But these were pioneers too, with dreams of their own, and theirs took a practical precedence over the plane. The arguments were powerful against it. Airplanes were expensive. It would cost more than sending a new missionary couple to the field, and just think how badly new missionaries were needed. An airplane was impractical. Who would fly it? No, Perkins' airy brainchild was grounded. But when the chairman asked him to lead them in prayer, they heard, "O Lord, help thy servants understand that we must give wings to the word." You see, after 10,000 miles on a mule, a man gets to behaving like one, especially a man with faith. Next Sunday at Sao Paulo, industrial center of Brazil, Roger spoke at one of the great Protestant churches in our hemisphere, saying, "Let us use the tools of our age. Let us have a herald with horsepower to carry the good news to every corner of the land." A few hours later, he was at one of the remodeled homes that serve as churches in the city, and when they sang, he managed to make it Wings Over Jordan. Roger Perkins knew his was not the only frontier in the land. There are fast-growing industrial frontiers like Volta Redonda, the sprawling steel city only recently sprung to life. Here was the 20th century, with all its power and frailty, restless, productive, discordant. Here was man forging new sinews, yet foundering in spirit, finding new tools, yet losing himself. And here, too, was the church. For this was no less a frontier than the mountains of Minas Gerais or the jungles of Mato Grosso. Here, in the shadows of the great plant, a man preached the redeeming love of Christ, spoke of men becoming masters of their tools, spoke of the forging of faith. Yes, this too was a frontier with its lonely men in mass, men throwing up houses and yearning for homes, building a standard of living but wanting a faith to live by. The pastor of the church at Volta Redonda is also a missionary pioneer. To this man, Roger spoke of the plane, and the missionary understood, encouraged him. You see, they spoke each other's language. Each had his own dream, but a common cause. Each would advance with the other's victory. Each would advance as Christ advanced. Together they went to the home of a crente, where members of the congregation had gathered to welcome the visitor and to discuss the work beyond their own community. From this frontier, the answer came, "We're with you." Everywhere and at every opportunity, Roger tracked his associates like an Airedale off the leash. A man with a purpose, he buttonholed his brethren and soared above their objections. He pleaded, studied, wrote scores of letters to Bahia, Belém, and the Board of Missions. And then, exactly a year after his first attempt, he reappeared for the mission meeting at Rio de Janeiro. He was still in the clouds, but with a down-to-earth answer for every objection. It was still mighty rough going up there, but he no longer soloed. Now there were others. There were others with the experience and the vision needed to see virtue in the idea, too. The chairman was one of them. Or maybe he was just getting worn down. At any rate, he succumbed to the air raids, and the battle of the boardroom was won. Now the idea would have to be approved at home, and the money raised by American churches. A big job still to be done. But Roger was just warming up. He would win. Deep in his heart, he'd always known he would win. And then one day, it happened at the Rio airport. Somewhere on that apron was a tiny plane bought largely by the giving of American Sunday school children and crated and shipped to Brazil. Yes, and eager for the sight of it, Roger Perkins and his pilot, George Glass. It was a little frightening, like seeing your child for the first time. Did it have all the parts? Was it all right? It was called Arautinho, the little herald of the gospel, and it was beautiful. A lovely 1,200-pound baby ready to go. Beautiful beyond words, and ready to go. The first flight was an evangelistic trip westward out of Rio, bound for the back country on God's business. A tiny plane, but with a full cargo of courage. How passive now. How lovely the land that once imprisoned him, stifling his work. Patience was a virtue, yes. But the music of that motor sang the virtue of something greater still. Progress. This circuit took them across the mountains to a river valley in Minas Gerais. A month by mule, 5 hours by the little herald. That town looked familiar, even after 3 years, even at 2,000 feet. Well, tail up, nose down, on target. So let them fly. They made their runs like veterans, bombing the villages with evangelical literature and leaflets announcing meetings later in the day. Out of the blue, the word of heaven. Little Herald, bombing for peace on earth. That night, they were 300 miles to the northwest, and there were slides. The bright beam lanced the darkness, lighting the screen and the hearts of the people. one could scarcely hear the breathing. So deep did the people drink of the moment, of the pictures and the words, and the things they said. In the years that followed, the Arautinho played its part in the overall work in Brazil. It is but a tiny thread in the great fabric being woven in Christ's name, a tiny thread designed to strengthen and sustain the whole. Most missionaries still ride the trains and trolleys, still ride the buses and automobiles, still need the mule. The real strength of the Brazilian church lies not in a machine, but in people. Not in the sky, but in feet firmly planted on the ground. The strength of this church resides in the quality of its statesmanship, in the unity between missionaries and national workers, in its strong lay movement for church extension, in its rugged independence of spirit. The church in Brazil, a great and growing force in the land. And part of all this, a small and yet inspiring part, the Arautinho. 2,000 hours in the air, 200,000 miles of Brazilian space. Roger never tired watching the land sit up and beg and roll over. 2,000 hours chasing horizons, erasing frontiers, flying food and film strips, pablum and preachers. Flying leaders to the backcountry and the coast. Flying the gospel of a Christ who lives and whose living and redeeming presence transforms all of life. 200,000 miles, flying between the evangelical outposts of Brazil, shuttling back and forth like a strong stitch, sewing the brotherhood ever more tightly together, helping to measure the church to the size of the land. And the Arautinho helps distribute literature off the presses of the Christian Publishing House at São Paulo. Most of it goes by commercial truck and plane, by mule and train. But some finds its way beyond the horizon to the frontier. And when God's word touches the earth, there is a purr of pleasure overhead. A song that slowly dies away as the Arautinho heads still further west. One day in the town of Juiz de Fora, Roger Perkins received yet another challenge from his old adversary, Brazilian space. He and George Glass were attending a meeting one afternoon, listening to a new series of records made by the Evangelical Church in Brazil. Someone had ridden hours to the nearest telegraph station to send the message. It was about Luisa, Bernardo's widow. Now she was ill, desperately ill, needed to be brought out to a hospital. There was only one way, the Arautinho, and no time to lose. Late in the day, too late to start on a trip of any distance. But Luisa was waiting out there, waiting as Bernardo had waited. Soon the night would close in, and they would be alone with space. The Arautinho was without landing lights, without radio communication. Just two men with the fuel and the faith to go the distance. Could they find the village in the night? And if they did, how could they land without lights? They couldn't fly above the mountains that had melted into the blackness, but they could feel them out there, pressing closely. Without lights, the Arautinho was a blind and fragile thing alone in space, flying through a void in which danger lurked, ever present and unseen. He saw the light. People had been waiting for hours and were lining the cow pasture with their lanterns, pointing the way. Going down. They knew the hazards of that strip. Could they make it? The earth was firm beneath them, the night air sweet, and the lights that bathed them, the loveliest ever lit. Before dawn, they took Luisa from the bed in which Bernardo had died. Her faith was strong. She knew she would be well again. In this woman, as in her husband, there was strength, for Christ lived in her house. Homes like this are the hope of Brazil. Yes, and the hope of the world. With Luisa, they headed eastward, back across the bulk of Brazil, back across the mosaic of the land, a vast land, a world in itself, a world to be won for Christ. The church in this land is a frontier church and the fastest growing church on earth. It has a rendezvous with tomorrow. It has planted a seed in fertile soil and is already tasting of the fruits. But it will not rest while yet a frontier stands, or God remains denied his whole harvest.